On the surface, Kirby Superstar seems to be a compilation of small, unrelated games. But looking at them, there does seem to be one possible connection. And that's that many of the bosses are birds or winged creatures of some kind. Spring Breeze has King DDD, who is a bird, as its final boss. The game Dynablade has a bird as the boss, Dynablade. And Revenge of Meta Knight takes place on a winged ship, shaped like Meta Knight himself, who is also winged. Milky Way Wishes places Marx as its final boss, who transforms into a winged monster. Wham Bam Rock doesn't fit into this category, but its mouth has an uncanny resemblance to the beak of King DDD, and the feathers on its head could evoke the image of a bird's feathers or wings, symbolically. We mustn't forget, of course, that Kirby can fly and is therefore also a sort of winged creature. So it starts to seem like all the games reflect this aspect of Kirby's own identity, the flying side of himself. In fact, the box art shows Kirby crowned by a winged sun, an alchemical symbol for spiritual rebirth. Out of all the power-ups featured in the game, the box art shows us Kirby in specifically his beam ability, in which he's dressed like a jester or a magician of some kind. Now, Milky Way Wishes, which could also be considered the last game in this collection, has a jester as its final boss, as if the final stage of the game is mirroring the initial or box art stage of Kirby's persona. Now, Kirby's name in Japanese is written as Kirby of the Stars, a star child, and he is often seen falling to Earth on a star. Now, we could maybe take this theme of birds and stars as being evocative of the spiritual plane, so often symbolized as being up in the sky. So this brings us to the element of air. Air is present in Spring Breeze, and in a sense the blade of both Dynablade and Meta Knight is symbolic of the element air. Kirby's whole thing is to breathe up air and shoot it out. The breath is his basic ability. A being who can take on human characteristics and is basically filled with air is sort of like the Kabbalistic golem, sometimes even the figure of the alchemical homunculus too. These are creatures born from human creativity, and the breath of life puts life into them. Now, sort of like Pinocchio, these creatures, in my opinion, can be symbolic of the hermetic path itself. One starts out made out of stone or rock, symbolically a sort of fake body or a fake self, and ends up acquiring a real body, one's true self, at the end of the process. All this imagery, then, is very fitting of the alchemical process. This process is represented in a series of woodcuts included in the Rosarium Philosophorum, a 16th century alchemical treatise. These show that the sun and the moon are in a tense and distant relationship, surrounding a star. And all of this is hovering above a fountain. The process which leads them to reconcile and love each other is accompanied by a bird descending from the central star. The bird, or winged creature, flies down from spirit to help the alchemist. Since this help comes in the form of an ordeal, it involves a personal struggle down into the darkness of the unconscious, then this bird might appear to us as a fearful figure, a sort of antagonist to the hero, as is the case in Kirby Superstar. And yet, fittingly, all these bosses are actually friends and helpers of Kirby in other games. In a sense, Kirby is also the winged being who is helping us, the player, advance on this path. His land, after all, is dreamland, or the psyche, the imagination. The alchemist, then, is reconciling the lunar aspects, or receptive, with the solar aspects, or energetic. The mastery of the lunar element is represented by the alchemist standing on the moon, with a new body which integrates both sun and moon. It's fitting, then, that Marx, whose hat is red, solar, and blue, lunar, we battle him on the surface of the moon. This theme of duality pervades other parts of Milky Way wishes, such as the battle against Wispy Wood, which in other games is normally just a single tree, but here is shown as twin trees. And at the core of all this duality in the game, we find Nova, the giant clock, regulating the day and the night, or in other words, time itself. Now, the alchemical process requires the alchemist to integrate this duality by first descending into the depths of the unconscious and then rising up to the heights of spirit. Kirby, too, first descends down into the Great Cave and finally up into the Milky Way. Time is often at the center of this as the main manifestation of duality, and one's initial encounter with it seems to be with the moon. Meta Knight wears a mask, so his identity is undefined, kind of like the golem, and his profile here is represented kind of like a crescent moon, once again placing Kirby's battle on the symbol of the moon, and making the moon into a sort of mask. In Revenge of Meta Knight, the whole adventure could be read as an escape from one's anxiety of time, and therefore a sort of transcendence of its influence on you. The game itself runs on a timer, and the halberd sinks down into the sea at the same time as the sun does, as if symbolizing the sunset itself, the chariot of time. In fact, this energetic solar force which creates time is the last thing which is devoured in the alchemical process. By giving oneself in, by giving up your control and sort of surrendering to the flow of life, one is born in an even more durable, more true self than before. This is what Carl Jung referred to as psychological individuation. In fact, devouring or eating is another main theme in this game. King DDD has stolen all of the food from Dreamland for a feast at midnight, the time at the end of the clock, therefore the end of time. The theme of food appears again in the fact that Kirby eats enemies to gain power. One of the games is a gourmet race, and the plot of Dynablade tells us that she has destroyed the crops, therefore all of the food. The flow of life has been halted in some way. Life is being greedily hoarded by the ego. Giving this up is a sort of death necessary for life to flow freely. Most Kirby games start in Green Greens, a bright and carefully tended garden, from where the adventure moves towards more dangerous locations like fire, ice, and so on. The Great Cave Offensive, however, switches this around by starting in a jungle area, a more rough and wild version of the garden, and then ending in the garden at the very end of the game. It's as if falling into the cave or the unconscious takes you directly into repressed territory, uncontrolled places. The deeper one advances down the cave, the closer one gets to the central sun, shining in a bright blue sky within the cave. The boss of this first jungle area is a whale, commonly a symbol of the cave archetype itself, as in the story of Jonah and the whale. The second stage, after the jungle, is a crystal maze, whose boss is a video game or a screen. This leads me to suppose that the crystal maze is symbolic of a hall of mirrors. A mirror is like a screen reflecting Kirby's reality back at him. If the whale represented this initial stage of being aware of the material world as a sort of cave in which one is trapped in a sort of Gnostic sense, then the mirror also is a classic Gnostic image of the world, but it's like a deeper version of the whale. Now, the material world is still a cave, but it's a cave which is reflecting your inner life. This video game boss, in fact, uses 3 enemies to attack Kirby. A slime, almost like Kirby himself, a formless being which can take on any other form. Then a dancing doll, again, a sort of formless human which is getting closer to be human. A Pinocchio figure, dressed as a jester. And finally, the individuated magician itself, the witch, now fully human. The next stage then begins to ascend from the cave upwards. We're in the old tower, whose boss is a chameleon. Again, this boss has the theme of the formless being who can mirror its environment. Basically, almost representing the pure possibilities of the color spectrum, being able to take on any one of these forms of visible reality itself. Let's remember then that both Dynablade and Marx fly with rainbow-colored wings. After the tower, we reach the sky within the symbol of the cave, so it's a sort of paradoxical mix of sky and underground. A conjunction of opposites. Most enemies here are birds or winged, emphasizing this sky quality, and the boss is Wham Bam Rock. Its feathered hat, mentioned before, is also parted into 2 sections like Marx. And a jewel on its third eye could represent this transcendence of duality and ascent of the middle pillar. So, to summarize, we could say that the main themes are, on the one hand, food, and it seems to represent life. The source of life is being blocked, or it's being hoarded, and Kirby needs to unblock this flow. On the other hand, we have time being in some sort of a struggle, and again Kirby needs to unblock this struggle of time. So, uniting these two, it could seem as if the source of food, or the source of life, is the same source which is beyond time, the same source that is arrived at by transcending time, therefore eternity. So it's interesting that the symbol of the fountain in this game is present, also it being the fountain of dreams, because mythologically this is such a classic symbol of the fountain of eternity, the fountain of youth. So it's interesting then that the box art tells us there are 8 games included inside, and it shows us Kirby surrounded by 7 stars. Milky Way Wishes requires Kirby to get power from 7 stars in order to beat Nova, who represents time. Now, Nova, the word Nova, is a sort of star, sort of much brighter star than the rest. So it could be that in the center of the 7 stars, or once you have passed through the 7 stars, you reach the 8th star, and this number for 8 already symbolizes infinity, so it could be eternity itself, the 8th star. In that case, Kirby himself dressed in his mage robes, takes this 8th position on the box art and is winged by the golden sun.